So, you want to know more about dungeons? Those deep, dark places of the world? Well, you've come to the right place.
Hey guys, welcome to A Fistful of Dice. My name is Matt. This episode of Dungeon Master Forge is entitled Dungeon Building 101, and we're going to be taking a look at some simple ways to build exciting, engrossing dungeons for your players. The technique that I usually use to construct my dungeons is called the 5-room model, and you'll see this kind of all over the place online. I use a slightly modified version of this idea, but essentially the idea is that you can create a dungeon following this 5-room model, and not just a dungeon, but any sort of adventure you want to craft. Now, that's not to say that your dungeon is only going to have 5 rooms, but it's called the 5-room model because you're going to have 5 landmarks in your dungeon that you're going to build the rest of the dungeon around. I'm going to show you how to do that today. I'm also going to be using my recent session with the Provokers as an example of how I use this method, because I used the 5-room dungeon building method to construct the dungeon that they recently delved into. So the first room in your dungeon is going to be the entrance. So I'm just going to build a little room here. The entrance. And the entrance is also going to have some sort of guardian. Now we draw our hallway. We're going to draw another room here. This room is going to be a puzzle or role play challenge. Now here we have a little bit of a split with rooms 3 and 4 existing sort of next to each other. One room will be the red herring. The second room will be the boss. Now that seems like a complete dungeon, but both of these rooms come to the final room, which is the twist. Now, as I said, this isn't necessarily what your dungeon is going to look like. It's not literally going to be 5 rooms, but this is a way of looking at your dungeon and laying it out in a way that's going to be fun for you and your players. So let's talk about each of these rooms in turn, and then I'm going to tell you how you can expand upon this idea and make your dungeons bigger and more complex. So the first room, entrance or guardian. This is where your players, maybe they haven't entered the dungeon yet. Maybe they're outside of it and they need to find a way inside. So for example, in the recent Provokers campaign, this entrance or guardian level was the Scarecrow room. So the Provokers had entered the dungeon after solving the puzzle and defeating the barbarians up above in the temple. And they had entered the dungeon and had found scarecrows in these alcoves, and there were 4 of them. When the scarecrows activated, there were also magical runes in the floor that started to glow. And I wanted to put a combat in this room that wasn't just kill everything and move on. I wanted there to be something else going on, and I wanted there to be a way for people who were less combat inclined to figure out a way to solve, or to basically end the combat. So in this case, what I did was I put the 4 scarecrows in there. I only had 3 activate, and the magical circle in front of the one that didn't activate didn't glow. So this tipped them off that the magical circles had something to do with these things activating. And the way they ended the fight was by destroying the magical circles, which basically ended whatever magical control was over these scarecrows. So they were able to stop the fight both in combat and sort of out of combat. So you had, Aerdon and Brasswick and Durgan sort of battling these scarecrows, and Dice is kind of running around figuring out what these magic circles do, and then all 4 of them are starting to bash the magical circles and end it. So you want this room to set the stage for your dungeon. If your dungeon has some sort of theme, you want something in here that's thematic. So, for instance, the dungeon that I was doing was a shrine to Geffion, this goddess of agriculture and harvest and spring. So I put scarecrows in here because when you think scarecrows, you think farmers, you think harvest, you think fields of wheat and grain. And so I wanted to set the stage for this dungeon, both setting up that it was, this sort of theme of harvest and renewal, but also it had a sinister kind of edge to it where, these scarecrows were put here to protect this place. So this is where you set the stage. This is where your players get the idea of what the rest of the dungeon is going to be about. Of all the rooms, this one's probably going to be your most straightforward room. Maybe it's just a combat. Maybe they have to bargain their way into the dungeon. It might be a stone face that asks them questions, something that is going to warm them up a little bit for the rest of the dungeon. You don't want this room to be too incredibly taxing. An example of this room outside of a dungeon, let's say your party's in a city and they're trying to complete a quest. The entrance or guardian might be something barring their path, a criminal underlord that they have to negotiate with, a band of brigands that they have to fight off, something to set up the rest of the quest and set the tone for the adventure that you've set up. Now let's talk about the second room, the puzzle or the roleplay challenge. Now, with the entrance, maybe you're getting something combat heavy, something a little bit more straightforward. The puzzle or the RP challenge is where you want your players to start thinking. Maybe it's a riddle. Maybe it's a physical puzzle they have to solve. Maybe it's something that they have to look inward, something that forces them to talk about their characters, their backstory, where they come from, their fears and their goals. You want this to be a place where your characters have a bit of respite before they move on to the heavier challenges within the rest of the dungeon. So, in the Provoker campaign, this was the room with the dwarven ghost. They entered the room, they saw that there was some sort of cave-in, and underneath the rubble of the cave-in, they saw a dwarven skeleton that had been crushed by the debris that had fallen from the ceiling. The dwarven skeleton had something clutched in its hand, and as they entered the room, a ghostly apparition appeared, and it was the dwarven ghost. The dwarven ghost explained that he was a farmer here, and that he was the caretaker of the shrine, and that he had been here for some time. The ghost actually wasn't aware that he was dead. He thought he was just sort of wandering the halls and still taking care of his job. But the ghost had a riddle that had been plaguing him since his death. And so the ghost presented the riddle to the party, and the party was able to both talk to this ghost, learn more about the shrine and the town of Brook, learn about who he was and what he was doing there, and also have a bit of a riddle. So they solved the riddle, again, thematic, tied in with the rest of the dungeon, and they also received a little bit of a side quest, because the dwarven ghost turned out to be the great uncle, or the uncle rather, of Turl, the hill dwarf that they had met in the session prior. Now, this dwarven ghost assumed that Turl was still a young boy, as he was when he died, but Turl's actually a grown man now. And this dwarf had a toy, a little stone dwarven warrior that he had made for Turl, and he asked the players to bring it to his nephew. And the players, of course, agreed. So in there, you're getting both a puzzle and a little bit of a role play challenge. The characters are having to negotiate with this person, talk to them, communicate, and also think together and talk with each other. So you definitely want this, keeping with the theme, but try to steer away from combat in this area. You want it to be something that's going to tax their minds rather than their character sheets, if that makes sense. Now, from here, you want the dungeon to kind of split off in two different directions. You want to present the players with a choice. It might not be left or right, but you want some sort of decision to be made that's going to set them off in two different directions. The first direction is the red herring. This is a room that seems like it's the end of the dungeon, if that makes sense. It's a tough encounter. The final resting place of an old artifact. Something that tells your players you have reached the end and you're about to complete the dungeon. So, in the case of the Provokers, it was the altar of Gethion. They arrived, they found this altar, there was nowhere else to go. This seemed to be the end of the shrine. There was an altar there with a resting place where it seemed the relic was supposed to be, but it wasn't there. Murals on the walls and things like that. I I didn't put any encounters in here or puzzles or anything roleplay oriented. I simply wanted this to be a room that would inform the players that there was something else going on, that they weren't quite done with the dungeon. So another option to do here, though, is to put an encounter here that is going to make the boss encounter even more difficult for your players. Something that wears down their hit points and their spell slots. Maybe it's even a tougher encounter than the boss fight. Something that you can throw at them that's really going to challenge them and make them have to think and be smart when they encounter the boss. So it should be noted that the red herring can also be bypassed entirely. If the party doesn't go to the red herring, it doesn't really affect the dungeon as a whole. It's, maybe there are greater rewards over here. Maybe there's more loot to be had, more treasure, more experience. But if they bypass this area of the dungeon completely, it doesn't negate their quest. They're still able to accomplish their goal if they don't go in this direction. This room over here, the boss room. Now, when I say boss, I don't necessarily mean a boss. I don't mean that you're going to go in and fight a Zelda monster, although, that's definitely feasible. But it's simply the final encounter, the thing that is going to make this dungeon memorable, the culmination of your party's efforts. So in the case of the Provoker campaign, it was the owlbear. They realized that the relic was not in this room, in the shrine. But I was dropping hints that it might be elsewhere. There was feathers and feces in this room here, which told them some sort of beast had come in here, and maybe it had run off with the relic. So they backtracked to the hallway and went into the cave of the owlbear, where they found the relic in its nest. And they were a little bit drained. Their spell slots, they didn't have as many spell slots anymore. And so this fight was tough. It was a pitched battle. And they managed to fell the owlbear and grab the relic. So this wouldn't necessarily need to be a combat. It could be some sort of negotiation or roleplay challenge. But I tend to have a combat be the wrap-up of a dungeon. I want the last thing the players do to have a climactic battle. I want it to be memorable. I want it to be, almost cinematic in that they, come into this final conflict, something that's been foreshadowed throughout the dungeon, something that, if they think about it, they should have seen coming. So, for instance, that's why I had feathers, throughout the dungeon and sort of telltale signs that an owlbear was roosting here. So, you definitely want to foreshadow either of these rooms kind of throughout the rest of the dungeon, giving your players little clues as to what awaits them further on in the dungeon. If they figure it out, they'll be rewarded when they find out they were right. If they don't figure it out, they'll have an aha moment when they do finally see it. Whatever it is that awaits them in this boss room. Now you're probably wondering what this final room is about, the twist. This isn't necessarily a room in your dungeon, but it's something that you can put in your dungeon to turn it on its head a little bit. I don't always use this. Sometimes this is enough for a dungeon. But the twist is something that lets the players know maybe, everything you did here in the dungeon, maybe it wasn't all for the right thing. Maybe they accomplished their task and they go back to town and realize that they were working for someone shady. In the case of the Provoker's campaign, it was returning to the surface and finding out that the Corruptor had returned to the temple and had killed the captives that they had left tied up on the surface. So it's kind of that punch in the gut. The feeling of victory, accomplishment, only to find that it was all maybe for naught. That to find out that they had caused the deaths of these barbarians who were, in no way innocent, but who were defenseless, and also finding out that they just defeated an owlbear, and now they're going directly into a combat with this massive armored man who they have heard about for several sessions. It is a punch in the gut. It's a sucker punch, and it's not to piss your players off. It's to make them excited. What I did here was I presented this twist and I ended the session. I felt that it was a natural breaking point and it left them excited for the next session. So, as I said, you don't always have to include this twist, but use it as a tool. Use it sparingly. Add it into your dungeons when you want there to be something that's just gonna turn it on its head just a little bit. So let's talk about how you can use this 5-room model to expand on a dungeon. I've said several times that I don't necessarily mean that this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rooms in a dungeon, but it's a way of laying out your dungeon and thinking about it. Maybe these are areas of a dungeon consisting of multiple rooms. Maybe in between these rooms, there's smaller rooms. Maybe there's a trap in here, loot in here. Maybe there's another area over here that goes off into a whole nother 5-room model. This is an idea too where you can have one entrance and multiple 5-room models coming off of that. So you'll have your entrance and Guardian, and then coming off of it, you'll have multiple puzzle and RP challenges, multiple red herrings, maybe a couple of different boss rooms. You can really kind of expand upon this and make massive dungeons using these tropes, these go-to sort of templates for creating a dungeon room. There's no reason why you can't build a fun, fulfilling dungeon that feels dangerous and deadly just using these 5 rooms. On the other end of the spectrum, there's no reason you need to limit yourself to these 5 rooms. There's no reason you can't expand upon these. Put hallways, labyrinthine hallways in between these areas of your dungeon. Put rooms in between. Put tasks in between, puzzles, traps, all of that sort of thing. Wandering monsters in all of these rooms. But in all things, I always say try to keep it simple. Don't overburden yourself with things that aren't going to give you return in the long run. If you're strapped for time, if you are feeling like you don't know what you want to do, if you don't want to lay it out, you can use this model as inspiration, as a base template, laying the groundwork for anything you want to do, whether it be a dungeon or a quest. This can easily be applied to something that's not in dungeons, something in an urban setting, something in the wilderness, cave systems, even just a role play sort of negotiation quest in a town somewhere or something. So this is a really versatile, useful idea. I definitely recommend the 5-room model. And I hope you guys will get some use out of it. I know I have gotten a ton of use out of this model, and I use it for most of my sessions. It's a really easy, versatile way to lay out a dungeon and lay out an adventure for your players. So let me know if you'd like some more dungeon building tips, going over traps, puzzles, encounters, that sort of thing. I'd be happy to do more in this series for Dungeon Master Forge. So that's going to be it for me. Take care, guys, and happy gaming all.